Hello my gaming gurus and welcome to the Level Design Lobby. Hey guys and girls, welcome and thank you for joining me, your host, Max Pears, to the Level Design Lobby. So today is another special episode, because they're all special. It's all a good time, we're all having fun here. But I have another reason why it's special. I'm joined by a very good friend of mine, a guest on the show, first time appearance, Daniel Howard.
Hello everyone, how are we?
They say they're good.
That's
told me.
Absolutely fantastic. I'm also very good.
Fred's a little bit down, but you know, Fred.
Well, that's how he is.
It's just who he is, and we respect you for it, Fred.
That's it. Be who you want to be.
You know? So, the reason we have Dan joining us on the podcast today is because when we're talking about narrative in games. Now, Dan is an independent filmmaker and screenwriter, so you have a lot of experience working, well, with narrative in another medium. So we'll be breaking down what tools will be used in narrative for films and TVs, and then techniques that we use in video games.
Yeah, that sounds great. It's a broad topic.
Yes.
And I think we've got some interesting talk ahead, is what I think.
We do. So, narrative, like I said, isn't just found in video games, it's found in other mediums, in many things. And Dan, firstly, do you mind breaking down the difference between narrative and story for our listeners?
So I think story is often classed as a synonym for narrative, and I think that's a common misconception. Yeah. I think story is definitely a component of narrative. I think for me personally, I break narrative down into sort of three main pillars, one of which being story or plot. Obviously, it's a massive factor of narrative, but as we've seen from a few games and many films over the last, 80, 90 years of sort of the cinema's heyday, you can have a narrative without any sort of rigid plot, rigid story. The other two pillars, one is character. I think character is the epitome of narrative. I think if you don't have strong characters, if you don't have relatable characters or likable characters, or even characters that you can hate, if you can really get emotionally invested in a character, then that's going to really fuel your narrative. So that's a very strong pillar. And I think the other one is kind of piggybacks off of that, and it's emotion. I think emotion, particularly empathy, is something that people overlook when talking about narrative, because most people talk about story and they talk about it as plot, something that's very sort of cold and clinical and sort of point A to point B. But I think really the heart of most pieces narrative is the emotion that it evokes and the empathy that you can feel.
No, man, I think that's a great one, because when I was starting off, I didn't know the difference between narrative and story, and I think it's important for people to understand this. So again, story is a part of it, and those are your three pillars, which I think people should, remember these. So with narrative, we've obviously got narrative in video games, and I want to raise this point up to you because we're just going to talk about it very briefly, because we could do a whole podcast on this. But there's some people, and there's a person that we've both been lucky enough to sit on a talk by multiple times, is a man named Ed Hooks, who is an animator consultant, very smart guy. He's got his own book as well, and we've been fortunate enough to sit on a few of his talks. But in a lot of his talks, I think the last one I saw was about a year and a bit ago. He might have changed his mind, but I remember him saying he doesn't believe that narrative in games is good enough because he believes that they can't create empathy. Now, this is a whole hot topic, but I personally think they do. We've now, in my opinion, like we were chatting about this just offline, games are in that heyday now of cinematic storytelling, despite my great beatboxing there. And we've passed the beginning stage, in my opinion. So what are your thoughts as a man who works in a different medium? Do you feel games have pushed past that? What are yours?
I very much believe they do, and this is what I was saying to you earlier. As much as I very much respect Ed Hooks, and I think he's a great mind and he's a great individual in that field, And like you say, we have both been lucky enough to sit in on talks with him, and I would urge anybody to sort of check out his writings or find him on YouTube, because he's a very, very learned man and someone you can take a lot from. But I do believe that statement was something that was true 15 years ago, maybe even 10 years ago, certainly true in the sort of what we now class as the retro era, the sort of 80s, 90s games. But I think there's a plethora of titles that you can look at over the last 5 years that I wholeheartedly believe showcase some of the best narrative empathy that you can put alongside some of the best films of all time. So it's a much heated debate.
Yeah, for sure.
And there are arguments both for and against. And like I say, historically speaking, you'll find more arguments for the fact that games don't evoke empathy. But I think if you're looking at contemporary titles, you'll be hard pushed to find some that don't.
That's it. I think one of it goes back to your pillar of narrative, which is emotion. And we have to remember that we're all moved by different sort of... how you convey the same emotion, for example, joy between us. You might have a different way to show or feel joy compared to me. I think that's it. Like, not every... Just because we all understand that emotion doesn't mean that every form of that emotion touches us.
Yeah, certainly. I think that goes for almost every entertainment medium, is that emotion is subjective. It's contextual. And I think things can mean different things for different individuals. But I think there's many games that follow that path. I think there's enough games now that you can look at them the same way you'd look at a piece of music or a fine painting, and different people could find different things in that. And I think that's part of this whole games as an art form movement. Yeah.
No, I agree. So we're going to go away from there. Also, please don't anyone troll Ed Hooks. We respect him. I was just saying, he was a man who raised that point and we just disagree. So again, like Dan said, check out his work if you can, because he's a very educated man and brings some very good points. So now, man, I want to ask you, what is some of the big techniques that you use to convey your narrative, to enhance your narrative in your own works, or that you've seen used in your medium?
So narrative is something that, just as as with games, historically speaking, film was quite crude. So it's an interesting parallel to look at the history of film as to the sort of the history of games. And obviously, there are techniques used nowadays to convey narrative and emotion and empathy that wouldn't have been used in the 1910s, the 1920s, 1930s. Obviously, you've got the writing of a piece, you've got the dialogue, the exposition. That is your most basic form of narrative structure. But film it's a visual medium, so it's always it's that classic idiom of show, don't tell. So outside of having just a character or say something out loud to an audience, or go through heaps and heaps of expositional dialogue,
exposition dumps, as they're also
known.
Dumps.
You can look at things like camera angles and shot composition. How they can convey a tone or an idea or an emotion, which I think is something that really this all draws back to convey sort of a narrative. You can look at how a piece is edited. That's a massive one to look at. To look at narrative, because it puts you. A good editor can put you in the mindset of a character, or it can put you in the moment, depending on how quickly it's cut, or how bits of information might be withheld from you until key moments. There's music and there's sound design to evoke emotions and to sort of pluck at your heartstrings a bit. I mean, I'm always moved by a great score. I find that music in film is very emotional.
Hans Zimmer, you beautiful bastard. Yeah.
And and coming off of the camera angles is also sort of cinematography in general, not just the actual shot itself, but how it's composed and the colour grading on that, sort of different colours signifying different things. So all of these things tie together in film to make one seemingly unnoticeable fluid movement towards narrative coherence. It's all about a lot of moving parts playing together to show the same thing.
I think I want to just interject with the camera angles and cinematography, Because in video games, I feel like we're only just starting to find our own like version of cinematography. You know, when you refer to a game, the first thing you talk about is the camera perspective, first person, third person, isometric, and most of the time, third person camera roughly is placed the same one from practically all third person games. First person, it's like that. Obviously, you're limited by technical views as well, because the struggle that we have is we give the camera control to the player.
Well, yeah, that's what I was just about to say. Actually, it's so difficult for games as a medium, because with film, you're forcing an audience to look at a certain frame. You're controlling everything that they can see and how they see it. But with a game, you're just saying, here you go, let loose. Yeah,
it's a scary thing. But what I will say, and I want to talk about Batman, the Arkham series. Some of my favourite games, Arkham Asylum is my personal favourite of the trilogy or quadrilogy.
Yeah, I think it is for mine as well, actually.
But what they do with their camera, to me, is one of the smartest ones that you don't always see. Is when Batman walks, it is right next to his shoulder, so he takes up 2/3 of the screen, showing how dominant he is. And then when he runs, the camera zooms out, so then you have a broader perspective of what's going on around him. Again, such a subtle thing like that, but compared to something, say, like Kingdom Hearts or Uncharted, which again are very good in narrative in their own rights, but not technically in cinematography that we're speaking. They just have it like, you know, Nathan Drake's roughly always in the center or slightly off one, you know, and like that's a small detail, and I think people should think about stuff like that. Like in most running games or something, like you're just following the character run, like. But I was experimenting with a small mobile game that I'm making, and I made it so when you're focused on the character, the camera is looking down at them, making them feel smaller, and then they encounter a dragon in the later levels, and then the camera switches to now looking up, making the dragon look even bigger. So again, like a small thing like that, but I just noticed when I handed it to players, no one said anything, but you could see a little smirk when things changed. So it's that sort of thing where I think us as games, we're still trying to find our feet with the technical side of a cinematography and also the emotional side as well.
Definitely. I think it's tough for games because it's hard to maintain complete control, but also allow the player to feel empowered. You don't want to feel that you're imposing restrictions on the player, but you'd also like to maybe have a few more traditionalist cinematography sort of tropes like that one you were saying. I mean that's quite it's a subconscious thing, I think, because it's been such a part of cinema for so long that it's just worked its way into the culture, and everybody has this sort of cinematic language that we all speak, you know, so we know that the camera looking up is dominance and that. So, but it is tough for games, so it's an interesting one.
Well, that's it. There's also another example of, the names escapes me off the top of my head. It's by Vlambert. It's like Luden. It's where you're flying this plane against German fighters. And what they do though is with the camera, when, say for example, you're doing a sharp turn coming down. I'm really sorry, I can't remember the name of the game, guys. That's the one. That's the one. And when you turn and come down, the camera doesn't instantly snap and follow you. Like it flies and drags, like just showing again the dramaticness of your sharp movements, and again makes everything feel even more like, holy shit, that was a close call, or I moved really fast then, you know.
It's not what would be a realistic perspective if you were in that position, but from a dramatic point of view it makes sense. Exactly. And it adds weight to your actions.
Exactly, which again I think, you know, I still like saying for cinematography games, we're still trying to find our line and our balance, and I'm not saying every game needs to do this, because you've got to think about what is the, like anything, you've got to think about what's the aim of your game, etc. But it is something I think more people need to take some time and just consider, not just going, it's first person or it's third person and that's where I leave the camera, you know.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. But it's an interesting one to look at the restrictions, like we were saying, and find inventive ways to work around what might be seen at first as a restriction, but make it seen as more of an art choice.
Exactly. So I'm going to talk about a couple of techniques that we use in games, and we'll go back to something that you use in films. So one of the things that we have is, as Dan said, is we give the player a lot of control of the character. And in films, you guys control what scene of your world. You know what I mean? Like, anything that's not in that shot may as well not be existing, you know?
Yeah, very true, very true.
But for us, especially with games becoming more open world games, there always needs to be something going on. So a lot of games will use environmental storytelling to do this. So a scene dressed up. So, for example, you come into a kitchen of a house and there is a blood stain on the floor, bullet shells near the bloodstain, and then the back door open. Now, there's a story there. You don't know fully what's happening, and that's, you know, it's up to the player's interpretation, which I think is something that we do different compared to most in films. Like you guys, like you have that very traditional beginning, middle, end, and you wrap everything up. Not every film, but I feel there's more that in film.
Yeah, as a rule of thumb, whereas the beauty of environmental storytelling is it's giving breadcrumbs. You know,
Yes.
It's leaving a trail, and it's allowing the player to discover or fill in the gaps themselves, which I think is something that cinema doesn't really have in most cases doesn't have the freedom to do.
That's it. I think it's like I say, it's come down to more freedom, but we can approach this topic, that scenario where Dan plays it and he believes someone was shot and killed here, and then they've taken the body outside. Or I could interpret it as someone was shot, they escaped through the back door, they could still be out there. You know, and that's what I think is the beauty of what one of the techniques we have here. Another thing that we use is a lot of collectibles and pickup messages, you know, audio tapes, emails logged on a computer, this sort of thing, which is, you know, is not normally connected to it is connected to the main story, but it's more for building lore. You know, like your character could completely ignore that if the player chose to. Say, compared to a film where we are following a number of characters or one character and we only see what they see, you know.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, isn't it? Like the data terminals or the books that you get in the Elder Scrolls series. Yeah. It shows how much lore is readily available if you want to dive into it, and it does put you in that character's position, because if you don't know it, they don't know it, and obviously some things might end up being useful later on. It might not. It's all contextualized, sort of a history of that world. It makes that world feel lived in. Whereas in film, unless you're watching something that's part of a greater series, and you might get an Easter egg to a previous installment or, you know, a spin-off, you don't really get that sort of that contextualized history. You just get that 90 minutes or 2 hours that you're there for.
Exactly. Do you want to move on to some other techniques, mate?
Used in games. So obviously, you mentioned Uncharted earlier on, and they are looked at as some of the best narrative-driven games, and they use much more sort of traditionalist. They focus on story. That's why they're regarded as real narrative-heavy games, and obviously that's where a lot of this big narrative-centric game movement has come from. Is looking at taking a very cinematic story and putting it in a game setting. So, you know, there might not be as much of an emphasis put on specific camera angles, you know, or sort of lore. It's all done the way you would do a film. So, you know, the Uncharted series you could quite easily look at as a film that you are just sort of living through. You know, the BioShock series, you can kind of look at that a bit. The Last of Us, you can look at that a bit. So that's a very, very common one. Yeah.
I think another one with games is mechanics. You know, like in films, you follow one character, and you see them grow through their actions. You know, there's a great TV show called Vikings, and what you find with one of their main characters, Ragnar Lothbrok, is every time there is a candle near him, he runs his hand through the flame, because he likes to play with fire. Because a lot of the stuff he does is risky.
Clever metaphor.
Exactly. More than just a pretty face, Daniel. As I stumble on my words. Not so eloquent, but that's a really interesting one. I think we transfer over that sort of stuff to our mechanics. There's a great one in a game called Final Fantasy VII Crisis Core, and what they do is you have this like kind of jackpot machine in the top right hand corner of your game when you're in combat, and it has all these characters that you've met throughout throughout the game. And if you land on 3 straight, it shows a memory of your character Zach with them, which then increases, say for example, your attack power or the speed or something, like it increases some sort of attribute. And I thought it was a great mechanic there, how we all just can just get a flash of a memory and it makes us feel something.
Yeah, and that's really clever. Very, very clever.
There's a great article on it on Gamma Sutra. I can't remember what it's called, but if you just Google Final Fantasy 7 Crisis Core, someone does an absolute amazing in-depth detail breakdown of it. Sorry, I've forgotten his name. And it was it opened my eyes to it, because I kind of got it a little bit when I was playing it as a kid, and then I read through it.
I think in a way as well, that kind of hits all three of my pillars of narrative, in the sense that it's character driven.
Yeah.
It adds emotional investment to that character for the player, because you're seeing their history, and obviously it's informing the story. It's exposition.
I'm going to do plot. That's it. I'm going to do a massive spoiler for this now. So, I mean, it's many years old, so I feel you can't blame me for this one. But if you know the lore and the story of Final Fantasy VII, the series, Zack Fair dies, and when you're on his sort of deathbed about it, his last final moments, you start to hit all these emotional things over and over, and you see he's really struggling to carry on because these people, he really wants to fight so he can go see these characters he's met, and he's remembering his family and his friends as he sadly loses this fight and passes away. So, like I'm saying, those random moments now build up to a point where you're constantly hitting these memory banks, and it just adds to the emotion. Like, it choked me up, and it was one of the only games to make me go, fuck, yeah, you know.
Yeah, it sounds it. I mean, I think it's very much been at the heart of everything that we've been saying. It's emotion. It's such a huge part of narrative, and especially because games are an interactive medium.
Yeah.
You know, if you can inject a little bit of emotion, it will resonate so much more, because your actions have weight. It's you that's done this. It's you that's lived this.
That's it. I think one of the other ways that we do it that we have the advantage of is the AI characters. You know, like whether you have it as a villain or a partner, you know, and then going back to the other point, like the mechanics with them. So you mentioned Last of Us, and think about, you know, you always needed Ellie to fetch a ladder or a bit of wood, and it's a point where you come to it I can't remember when, but it's like 3/4 into the game, and that's it. You know, when they escape the cannibals.
Yes.
And it's just after that, it's the following chapter, and you
spoilers again. Hey?
Yeah, well, I feel again you should have completed this after years. But they do a thing where they subvert the mechanic, where Ellie was constantly going off and fetching it for you, and then you go over to it and you press the button, she doesn't show. You press it again, and she doesn't show, and Joel goes Ellie, because you can instantly see the change in her demeanour because of this.
It's quite an emotional scene, actually, that one, isn't it? Yeah. And
again, just because also what makes it emotional is you had Ellie help you. Like, she's had a purpose. If you look at her compared to in Resident Evil 4 when you rescue the president's daughter.
Well, this is what I was just about to come on to when you mentioned the sort of companions and the emotional weight they can bring. That is very, very true. But there are so many examples of how it may have been done poorly. And I think that's why the ones that get it right, they really get it right. Yeah. And you are really involved and emotionally invested in those characters. And the two that I'm really thinking of are two that were from the same year, one being Ellie from The Last of Us, and the other being Elizabeth from BioShock Infinite. And it's funny that they both came around in the same year. And I think that those two games, in my mind, obviously they weren't the first games to be really narrative heavy. Yeah. They weren't the first games to sort of get you sort of emotionally involved, but they're very much at the forefront of this movement, I think. Yeah, man.
I think, like you're saying, it's down to things, and I would recommend checking out either Ico.
Yeah, played Ico.
Yeah, great.
Which is an older one.
Yeah.
When I say older one, it's not particularly old, but when you're looking at this sort of movement, it's
still very early on.
PlayStation 2.
Yeah, and they're doing the remake for PS. Yeah. No, is it Shadow Colossus they're doing? They did the remake for
They
PS3.
did a PS3 remake, and then they're doing a remake of Colossus for 4. Yeah.
And also check out Last Guardian. It's by the same team.
Yeah, I'm playing through that at the moment. Actually,
So I'm not giving any spoilers because now you have the power to reach them and punch me. But when you play that and how they use the character relationship there, throughout the whole game is very smart.
Yeah, I've only played maybe about 90 minutes or so, but I'm already getting that.
Yep.
Yeah, as a sense.
That's it. And I think again we have the you have that with, I think you have it better with TV shows compared to films, like building
definitely
up bonds.
In terms of the hours spent with a character, you'll get more out if you spend 10 hours with a character as opposed to 2.
Yeah.
And it is true, TV shows have really come into their own again in the last sort of 5-10 years as a real strong narrative art form, because you've got shows like The Sopranos or Deadwood or Breaking Bad or Mad Men that are really embracing this character-driven, emotionally built story that you can get invested in, and it's very much the same thing that you see happening in the games.
Yeah, man, that's it. And I want to talk about a game now because one of the things we use is cinematics as well, like cutscenes. So they fall into what Dan's mentioned earlier, the techniques used in film. But a game which you wouldn't think to have some of the best narrative and lore, yet does, is Overwatch.
Yes, yeah, very interesting actually that you come on to that.
Yeah, so I suck at the game. I will never be a pro player, that is for sure. I think I rage quit the last time I played because it had been so long, and I was like, why do I suck? And I'm always the healer, and I always end up people screaming at me, where are you, Max? Well, I'm dead, so it's hard to heal you from the grave. But enough of my poor plays of Overwatch. So they do a lot here, and I want to talk about how they do it. We spoke about this briefly before. Now you have the stuff like the short animation films, you have the comic books, and there's a whole Wikipedia and stuff as well, and fan theories out there. So you've got the expanding lore, but it's what they do in-game that is really clever. So you have character dialogue. So when a character called Reaper sees a character called Mercy, Reaper will say to Mercy, "This is what you made me," showing to say that
there's a history.
Exactly. And they all have this with other characters that they see. So even their victory to their death voices, just like I said, even if you're on the same team, say certain things. Or when you select a character for a certain map, they have slight changes in it. Not huge, but again, a certain character who knows the area, I believe, says certain lines compared to another. They use a lot of environmental storytelling because some of these maps are the home areas of
some of the characters.
Yeah. So you see that. One of the recent ones that's just been announced is called Junkertown, which is the home of Roadhog and Junkrat. And you're going to see certain things like their beds or something, their rooms, so this is what they did or where they stayed.
Yeah, you get a bit more of that character history.
Exactly. Another thing they use is the location of their maps. Now, compared to Unreal Tournament, again, this is before the big narrative moved, great game in its own right, is they were just lunar colonies on Mars, but it never, okay, it's a futuristic space game, and that was kind of it. Well, what they're doing here is, because it's a different version of Earth, and the characters are so diverse in terms of where they are, you've got characters from the Middle East, characters from the Far East of Asia, English characters, American characters from Brazil. The maps are actually based in Earth, so there's one in London, there's one in Brazil, there's one in Mexico, and again showing their world because it's all grounded in this world, and they have landmarks like Big Ben, for example, that we see the pyramids, and then a character might say something when seeing this landmark. So even their map locations relate together.
That's cool. That's very cool.
And then another one is their DLC. So there was DLC that came out recently. It was like a timed exclusive where it was this horde mode, and it was one of the very first missions of a character called Tracer. Now you could only select 4 characters, and that was Tracer, Mercy, Torb, I can't pronounce his name, builds the turret, and Reinhardt as well. And you instantly saw there that you could now put together, these four know each other well.
From back when this was the thing.
Yeah, and again, they don't have... And there's a great talk on GDC, if you want to watch it, called Overwatch An Optimistic Future, which their lead narrative or senior narrative designer talks about these techniques in much more detail. But these are some of the things, like I said, that they use, and I think we could all take away from and learn from, compared to something, say, like Destiny, which when it first came out, it received criticism for lack of a story. I know it addressed this later in their expansions and built upon those lessons further in Destiny 2.
And it's one that had so much potential.
Yeah,
as well.
The Halo series has got good narrative in it as well. You know, it's a good narrative series. I didn't play all of them, but the stuff I did play was really good. You know, so again, but it's interesting because, you know, I worked in the Division and we struggled with getting the narrative across as well, similar to Destiny, with it being a multiplayer game online. Because you never knew where all four players were going to look. So this is a really difficult thing for us to do in terms of like an event, for example.
Try and direct focus to what you want to see.
But how they've done it in Overwatch, where it's just like a team deathmatch. Like I said,
very, very clever.
Yeah, very smart people, you know.
But again, it comes back to, it's all about character.
Yeah.
It's all about contextualizing what you're telling the player, and again, leaving that breadcrumb trail.
Yeah.
Letting them fill in the gaps. So the casual player might not have picked up on it. It's just what the characters are saying. Doesn't really matter. Yeah. But if you're tuned in, if you're enjoying it, and if you do want to learn more, there's that trail to follow. And then there's the expanded stuff as well.
Yeah, man, that's it. I think also, like, I found ones where I touched briefly on it was mechanics. Like I said about the whole emotion thing with Final Fantasy 7, but it's also like those main mechanics. Now in Overwatch, for example, Reinhardt is a big, strong, honourable dude, and one of his mechanics is he puts down a shield to protect others, showing his value there, like that he is all about protection. You know, despite how big he is, he's there to look after. You know, for example, Reaper has this teleporting mechanic, and the particle effects just make you know that this dude's really fucking evil, because it's like this shadowy sort of, and then he says like something in his weird, creepy voice, stuff of nightmares that just again sell, because they work with mechanic, you know, like, and he uses that teleport to flank players as if he's a backstabber, and that's
very clever.
You know, again, how we can use to show that stuff there, mate. You know, but I believe we're now coming to the end of the podcast. You know, thank you very much.
Yeah, it's flown by. It's been great.
It has, man. I've enjoyed it. So before we go, I have a couple of questions to ask you, sir. You're saying you're playing recently The Last Guardian. Is there any other games that you're playing right now that you're enjoying?
I'm going through Uncharted: The Lost Legacy as well.
Is it good? Like I want to pick it up.
It's very good. Very much enjoying it. Yeah, plays just like 4, as you'd imagine. Obviously, no Nathan Drake, so I want to say it's a little different, but not entirely. Okay, it's still got the Uncharted spirit. You know,
cool.
Obviously, it's still got that sharp writing, great dialogue, humor, and because it does play and look just like 4, it's still very cinematic. Yeah, definitely give it a shot.
Awesome, man.
That's about it. That's what I'm playing. Yeah, just those two at the moment. Nice and easy.
Yeah, as you say, you can't really play much more.
I've not really got a lot of time. I wish I had more.
So, Dan, mate, is there anywhere that our listeners can reach you and see what you're up to, man?
I am on Instagram. I'm there every now and again, and I do have a Twitter. Both of those, I'm under the user Doward24.
Cool.
That's also my PlayStation gamer tag. If anyone wants to check out what I'm playing, it's most likely going to be Uncharted, so that is a single player venture at the moment, but I'm always down for a game of FIFA or something. Yeah, I'm out and about.
That's good. Well, I mean, you sat down, sure.
Right now I'm not out or about.
But no, I'll put a link to that in the description of the podcast as well. So, guys, thank you, and girls, thank you very much for joining us on this episode as we talked about narrative in games. We hope we've opened your eyes to techniques and can see how you can push them further than what we've given. So, to follow me on Twitter, if you have examples of other great games that use narrative, hit me up at MaxPez. And most importantly, guys, subscribe to the podcast. Let us know that you're enjoying what we're doing and that you're finding it interesting so that we can keep making these episodes and keep growing together. Alright, guys, thank you very much. Take care, and we'll see you later.